Okay, good evening. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Keisha Rogers, and I want to welcome you to our LaRouche PAC Monday night strategic update and discussion. Tonight's discussion is going to be led by Susan Kokinda, and the title, the theme of our discussion tonight is going to be Political and Strategic Turbulence Signals End of the System. And as we described in the invitation to tonight's discussion, we have seen the unfolding of several major events take place. One, that you've had a major war that has now broken out in the Middle East. Also, you saw the removal of Speaker of the House and the ongoing battle that's going on in the Congress around the emergence of a new Speaker of the House, but also what is demanded on this front we'll be discussing much further in terms of the role that LaRouche PAC is playing and what is required of a new speaker. Also, you have the continued, what we describe as a Gestapo against the American people, against President Donald Trump. And this is coming from the weaponized justice system, from the continued insane courts and the DOJ and others that are continuing to push the prosecutions and indictments of President Trump. Now, today, President Donald Trump spoke to an audience in New Hampshire. Also, and he had many remarks and comments to say on the ongoing crisis, the ongoing war front. And as he's continued to say, if he was president of the United States, we would not be in this crisis. We would have peace in the world. And also, as he said, in pertaining to the ongoing war in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, that this would not have happened. So as we indicated in our remarks in terms of leading into this discussion, a second presidency of President Trump is absolutely critical to what Susan will describe as breaking the sound barrier into a new system. And I think that this is extremely important. President Trump also, if people haven't heard, you can listen to his speech that he gave in New Hampshire. And one of the things that he addressed really correlates. People have heard him say numerous times to recite the fable of the snake. It's Aesop's fable. And this time, once again, he related this to what is actually happening from the standpoint of the ongoing threat of terrorism, the threat of what's happening at our borders, the influx of illegals coming into the United States, and the need to actually secure our borders, the need to stop these endless wars. And it was very fitting for the time in terms of, once again, reciting that. What I want to just say lastly, as I said, we have initiated a major front in terms of demanding citizens, the MAGA movement, America First, Trump supporters, to put forth a call campaign into Congress. And one thing we've been doing, as people know, is we initiated a petition calling for stopping the prosecutions against President Donald J. Trump now. And also what we have called on people to do in the wake of the ongoing battle that has continued in the Congress is to initiate a threefold call. And we'll talk more about that. But this call to your Congress members, especially those who have been involved in continuing to push massive aid and funding to Ukraine, that there was a bill prior to the removal of Speaker McCarthy. And a lot of this was centered around the fact that more funding and more members of Congress were pushing additional funding to aid the war in Ukraine. We should call to demand that this is stopped immediately. Also, that the borders are secured, that we stop the influx of illegal immigration into the United States, and also stop the weaponization of the justice system and end the prosecutions of President Donald Trump?
Thank you, Keisha. Yes, as Keisha just said, obviously it's been a very momentous week with the upset in the House with the removal of Kevin McCarthy, obviously over the weekend, the outbreak of a very dangerous war in the Mideast. And of course, this is layered onto already dangerous war in the Ukraine, intensified lawfare against Donald Trump and against every single member of his movement, as was recently exposed in Newsweek by William Arkin, that the FBI is now targeting all of us, which perhaps is not a surprise, but now it's official. And you also have economic tumult with the UAW strike continuing, and actually a number of other strikes piling on top of that. Now, there are going to be scores and hundreds of headlines and scenarios and analyses of all of these events. Some analyses may be more competent and sober than others. But I would suggest that anybody who claims they actually have some hard and fast analysis of how the speaker fight is going to come out, what was behind it, what is happening in the Mideast, and so on, is probably talking through their hat, because these are very complex situations, which are being driven, as I'm going to make the point in my discussion tonight, by the fact that we are at the end of a system. The current globalist financial system cannot be sustained in its present form. And the global elite feel mortally threatened by Donald Trump and the Trump movement, and equally mortally threatened by the fact that they've probably run out of tools in terms of their current toolbox for holding this financial system together. Now, the one thing that we can say definitively, as Keisha said, is that if Donald Trump were president of the United States, this wouldn't be happening. And therefore, we must make him president. Now, that is absolutely true, but it's not adequate, because unless it's located in an understanding of the larger dynamic within which it's embedded, that is, the end of a system and the necessity to put a new system in its place, unless we're operating from that standpoint, we probably won't succeed in putting President Trump back into the presidency. Because again, what is driving this is the end of a system. Most immediately, it's the end of the post-1971 financial system, which has now metastasized into what we today call globalization. President Trump, when he was in Michigan speaking to auto workers about a week and a half ago, he was very precise. He went after the global financial class by name. He went after the Wall Street predators. And if you want to give it its kind of species designation, it's the central banking system. And it's the turbulence that we're living through right now, whether it's the outbreak of war in the Mideast, or the political conflict here at home, or the fight over a new speaker, what is really driving it is the fact that the axioms, the practices of the previous period simply don't work. We have to leave the old system behind and push through the sound barrier to a new system. Now, I use the image in the email announcing this discussion tonight of the Concorde, which no longer exists, of course, the Concorde breaking the sound barrier. And you see in that image the creation of a shock front and the plane punching through basically to the other side, where it's going from the subsonic domain to the supersonic domain. Now, there's a really important physical principle, which is equally important for our political situation, involved in going from one phase space, below the speed of sound, to another phase space above the speed of sound. And that is, you actually have to have a particularly configured kind of aircraft to be able to do this. It has to be minimally a swept wing aircraft. If you tried to go through the sound barrier in something which wasn't properly configured, even if it could go faster, it wouldn't work. You'd break up. And I would just say that we aren't going to make it to the other side of the turbulence that we're in right now in a vehicle which is based on globalist or imperial principles. We're going to have to recreate our economy and our culture and really all of our policies on the principles that are embedded in the American Revolution and Alexander Hamilton's American system of political economy. But we actually have to go back further than that. And in a minute, I'm going to share with you a very brief excerpt from Lyndon LaRouche, which addresses that the fact that you have to go back much further. Now, I also want to point out that on Saturday, our colleague Dan Leach, assisted by Tony Pappert, addressed this question of the principles embedded in the old system in a very powerful class on the Prometheus principle, where I think he painted a very vivid picture of the difference between the oligarchical principle, which in the Prometheus legend is embodied by Zeus, which is the gods on Mount Olympus, or the globalist class, or the elites, whatever you want to call them. But the oligarchical principle, which we see throughout history, we see it in empires, we see it in various isms like communism and fascism and totalitarianism, and today we have globalization. This is an enemy which seeks to crush the human principle which sets us apart from the beasts and gives us our ability to discover, to harness fire, to create. And this principle throughout history comes to very powerful fruition with the American Revolution. But it's this longer arc of history, this battle between two systems, an imperial and oligarchical system, which is in the process of failing, and the need for us to renew and recreate that human system. That's what really defines the crisis that we're in today. Now, what I want to do is share with you just 5 minutes of what was a relatively extensive speech that Mr. LaRouche gave in 2008 on the issue of the Mideast. And of course, it's very, very relevant to what is going on today. But the 5 minutes that I'm going to share with you, the excerpt that I'm going to share with you, is very much along the lines of this question of the imperial system.
Why this conflict? Well, we have to go back a little bit more to ancient history to understand these things, because men are not animals. Human beings are not animals. Animals have no history. They have a biological history, but they have no cultural history. Mankind's conflicts of today are the product of a cultural conflicts in cultural history. And we must look back perhaps 1 million years to get some glimpse of this. Come back then to the situation in the so-called Middle East and see the Middle East not as having its own history, but as the Middle East as something within the process of history. And the other part is, don't look at the Israeli-Arab conflict. Don't ignore it, but don't look at it. Because the conflict is not determined by the Israelis or Arabs. It's determined by international forces which look at this region how? As a crossover point between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. The relationship of Europe to Asia, the relationship of Europe to East Africa, and so forth. Therefore, what you're seeing is that. Now, go back and say, where did the British get this idea? As they did with Sykes-Picot. Where did they get the bright idea of keeping the Arab population and the Israeli, what became the Israeli population, at odds with each other permanently, killing each other over land that wasn't worth fighting over in terms of its quality? Ask yourself, what is the development of this territory? What is the development of the conditions of life of the people? What is the development of the conditions of life of the typical Israeli? Look at the Israeli of the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s, the early 70s, where there was progress. What do you see today? You see decadence, accelerating decadence, and an increase in warfare. What do you see in the Arab condition? Decadence. And you sit there with despair and say, are these people just going to kill themselves into extinction? Kill each other into extinction? What's wrong here? Well, somebody's playing them. Somebody's playing and orchestrating the situation. Who? How do the British come in on this? Well, go back, for example, to the time that Lord Shelburne, who was the boss of the British Empire, at that time was not the empire of the British monarchy. It was the empire of the British East India Company, which had private armies and private navies and private funds and a lot of drugs. What we learn from that? Well, how did Shelburne come into power? How did he become this leader in February of 1763 of the British what became the British Empire, which was really the empire of the British East India Company, not the empire of the British monarchy. That came later with Victoria. Huh? It came because of the 7 Years' War. What was the 7 Years' War? The Anglo-Dutch interests, which were largely banking financial interests, orchestrated a period of warfare among the nations of continental Europe, back and forth, playing the very skilled military commander of Prussia, the Great, in perpetual warfare, which resulted in the ruin of the nations of continental Europe through mutual warfare and its effects, such that in February 1763, the British walked in and dictated a treaty called the Peace of Paris, which established the British East India Company as a private empire, which led later to the formation under Victoria of the so-called British Empire. Since that time, this group, which is not a group of people as such, I don't think of British bankers as people, because they don't act like people. They act like clever apes, but with the instincts of apes. That what was done in this whole period, especially in dealing with the Lincoln process, the Lincoln effect, and the 1873 effect, was not to engage a direct war against the United States, which they intended to destroy, but to subvert it, to neutralize the U.S. in its own development by various kinds of crises.
I wanted to play that excerpt because he comes very, very much to the point that in the crisis in the Mideast, and he references other wars in Europe, and then he references the subversion of the United States after Lincoln, is carried out by a British imperial system. And he makes a very precise point. It's in its original form, it was not under the monarchy. It was under the British East India Company, which in a sense has a much greater similarity to what we're dealing with the global financial class today, with all of their appendages, with big finance and big pharma and big tech and so on. It's like a modern day British East India Company, but that they would play nations against each other. And in a sense, until the United States of Abraham Lincoln came along, and they recognized an absolutely mortal foe as we began to develop industrially, scientifically, and elsewhere. And then they shifted to the policy of trying to subvert the United States. And he then, a little bit later in the speech, and I do encourage people to watch the excerpt, and we'll post it in the chat, and also when we put this on YouTube and Rumble, he makes the critical point which is as relevant today, if not more so, than it was when he gave this speech back in 2008, because he returns to the seemingly intractable crisis in the Mideast. And he keeps stressing it's not going to be solved from within the Mideast. And I might add, the dysfunctionality of Congress is equally not going to be solved from inside the Congress. He says the solution, the principle is to end this blasted imperial system. And that is the solution for what we are facing today. Again, the crisis, the turbulence that we're going through is being driven by the fact that the rulers of this imperial system are very, very threatened and are very dangerous and desperate because of that. They're obviously politically threatened by Donald Trump and the MAGA movement and Trump's intention to restore the United States as an actual sovereign nation. They're also threatened by the fact that Donald Trump thinks other nations should have the right to be sovereign as well, as he said very forcefully in numbers of speeches when he was president of the United States, and that his relations with other nations, including nations we had intense economic and other conflicts with, like China, Donald Trump always approached it from the standpoint of you're a sovereign nation, we're a sovereign nation, whatever differing interests we have, we can work them out, as opposed to what Mr. LaRouche described in more detail in that speech, which is the British Empire treating everybody like a piece on the chessboard. And when you get to the Mideast and you look at the outbreak of the current crisis today, you are dealing with pawns and rooks. Believe me, there are very few even queens on the board in the Mideast. These countries, these factions, they are all being played by the imperial system for larger strategic and political goals. And again, there's lots of headlines and lots of scenarios out there, you know, whether it has something to do with the looming treaty between Israel and Saudi Arabia, whether it's being played back into the United States in terms of the speakers fight and building up the neocons, who of course are flexing their muscles around this crisis, whatever aspects of this. And again, I don't think anybody knows for certain how this thing is unfolding. It's a subset of the fact that a desperate imperial system is seeking to reassert itself. And it's not just in the United States, of course. We've seen the election in Slovakia of a new leadership, which is very much opposed to the expansion of the Ukraine war. Hungary is in the hands of a fairly strong national leader, Orban, who's very supportive of Donald Trump. There could be changes in Poland. The AfD alternative for Germany, I'm not going to torture people with my non-existent German, just scored major gains in Germany. Again, another party which is basically standing up and saying, what you're seeing is parties which are standing up and saying no to the expansion of the war and trying to act in the self-interest of their own nation, as opposed to some imperial overlord. So you have this imperial elite is being threatened by this resurgence, potential resurgence of a world of sovereign nations working with each other against this imperial elite. But the other side of the threat to to the imperial elite, to the globalists, is the looming end of their international financial system in its current form. Frankly, it's been like a dead man walking since the blowout of 2008. They kept it walking with this insane zero interest rate policy, which went on for over a decade and was just finally scaled back in the last year and a half. And now we've added And that, of course, is causing all sorts of enormous strains, which we'll probably be discussing in future webcasts. But now you have the Bidenomics, which is the most unbelievable spending spree, certainly in our history. Maybe you can go back to Weimar Germany. We may be getting pretty close to that as well. So what do we have now? We have a quadrillions in speculation sitting over the financial system, trillions of dollars in debt, which can't be paid. It is really unsustainable. Now, in reality, it's been a dead man walking since August 15th, 1971, when President Nixon, under pressure from the British, took down the Bretton Woods System, and with it, the system of fixed exchange rates and the gold reserve system. But really, it was the beginning of the end of an economic system which, at least in the United States and in most of the other developed nations, was based on increasing physical production, technological progress, and constantly lifting up the living standards of its population. That 1971 decision was really the first step in what has been a half a century assault on those human policies of economics. Now, Lyndon LaRouche and our movement fought against that every step of the way for over a half a century. We fought against the free trade policies. We fought against the financialization of everything, where everything was simply turned into a money stream, whether it was your healthcare system, your transportation system, your economic system. Over the course of the past 50 years, you no longer have an energy sector. You have a financial stream for the financial parasite. We all know you no longer have a healthcare system. You have a financial stream for the parasite. And we fought against that every step of the way. We fought against the assault on living standards. We fought against the perpetual wars and the increase in the police state in this country through which they enforced these policies. And Lyndon LaRouche paid the price. As many of you know, he was indicted by Robert Mueller, the first of many indictments. A later indictment ultimately resulted in him spending 5 years in prison. So those imperial policies continued throughout this period until Donald Trump disrupted that with his election in 2016. And of course, he then paid the price with unrelenting Russiagate impeachments and so on, and his removal from office through the because the elites knew that if he returned to office in 2020, they were going to be in big trouble. And now they're even more desperate because they know Donald Trump is much more prepared to march into the presidency in January 2025 and begin to take the hatchet to their entire globalist infrastructure. So they are more desperate than ever before because they again, you're in this turbulent period where they see their system ending, both by the potential of these political assaults and by the fact that nothing is going to hold this system together economically. So they are in a frenzy and they are going to intensify their very dangerous policies, hence the outbreak of this war in the Mideast. We've already seen it in terms of the danger of the war in Ukraine escalating into a thermonuclear confrontation with Russia. And of course, the intensification of the police state actions against President Trump and, as I say, against his movement. And that is why we have to intensify our efforts, number one, to stop the funding for this war in Ukraine, and number two, most especially, demand that Congress shut down the prosecutions of Donald Trump so that he can campaign unimpeded. And if he can campaign unimpeded, he will be the next president of the United States. So therefore we have to fight to stop these dangerous and criminal and illegal activities. But we at the same time, this all has to be animated by a very clear understanding that not only is the old system dead, but it's in knowing what we are fighting for, the nature of the new system, that we are going to succeed in defeating them. Now, I just want to touch on two other headlines of the current period in order to, further elaborate on this point. The first one is the UAW strike, which is continuing. And people may have seen that there are other strikes. UAW workers at Mack Truck just voted by 73% to, I guess, 27% to reject the tentative contract. So they went out on strike today. That's 4,000 workers in about 5 or 6 states. Healthcare workers at Kaiser in California are on strike. There's a strike at Blue Cross Blue Shield here in Michigan, and I think there are other strikes going on. This is one of the greatest strike waves we've seen in recent history. And yes, it is a strike for wages, because the working population has quite bluntly been screwed over the course of recent decades. The auto workers in particular are simply trying to get back what Joe Biden and Barack Obama took away in 2009, when the auto industry was bailed out. More importantly, the Wall Street predators were bailed out, and the auto workers were forced to give up wages, cost of living increases, pensions, and everything else. So much of the demands of these strikes is about wages in a desperate and frankly probably losing effort to keep up with inflation and everything else. But there's something larger in terms of this strike. And again, it gets to this question of the battle between two systems. Because a large number of the auto workers, and we've been going to the picket lines and we've been going to the auto plants at shift change, they know that Joe Biden's forced march to electric vehicles is going to kill their industry and get rid of their jobs. The UAW president, Shawn Fain, he's negotiating for a fair transition to electric vehicles. A lot of these workers know there is no such thing as a fair transition if you don't have a job. I mean, yes, the UAW is getting concessions that some of the battery plants will now be under the master contract, which means they would be higher wages. But higher wages don't mean much when you've lost 40% of the jobs and 40% of the industry. And a lot of the auto workers know that. So there's a political aspect to this strike. That is, there's an aspect to this strike which is fighting against the green agenda, the environmentalist insanity of this global elite, which is using their green agenda for the further deindustrialization of the United States. But we have to bring something more into this fight. And that is really an image of how you would not just preserve the existing auto worker jobs, because we've lost millions of auto worker jobs over the decades. How do you rebuild the United States as a manufacturing superpower? And the auto industry, as Lyndon LaRouche often talked about it, is the make everything industry. It's the embodiment of the machine tool principle, which means you're constantly bringing new technologies into the productive process as you're increasing your ability to produce. And the auto sector could be producing for everything. They could be producing for the space program. They could be producing for Donald Trump's challenge to build hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of new power plants. They could be producing for new forms of transportation, while those of us who love our internal combustion engines will continue to drive our internal combustion engines. But we can expand this industry rather than just trying to hang on and stop a further devolution, we've got to give to the auto workers and to the American people this vision of what a rebuilt economy would actually look like. So that's the headlines in terms of the auto workers strike. The obviously other big headline is the speaker's fight, and there will be a vote tomorrow, Tuesday, on this. I frankly will be surprised if there's any resolution to this very quickly. Because, we all know what precipitated this. Matt Gaetz and the Freedom Caucus had enough. They pulled the plug on, not just on McCarthy, but they pulled the plug on the way Congress has been turned into a rubber stamp for the macroeconomic policies of the Federal Reserve. Congress, in a sense, like our economy, has become non-functioning because it's no longer operating under constitutional economic principles. I don't just mean the rules of the Congress in terms of voting on individual bills and so on. Our Congress only works if it's actually legislating and implementing policies of economic growth. If it's acting from the standpoint of the American system. And frankly, until we have a Congress and we have an American population, I think we're on our way to having a president, but until you actually have forces who are fighting for the American system of political economy, Congress is going to be pretty dysfunctional. And I don't know how this speaker fight is going to come out. Again, part of the scenario mongering is the war in the Mideast is now strengthening the hands of perhaps Kevin McCarthy or people like that and so on, and play into this. Again, I don't think it's worth it to dwell on these scenarios. What we have to do is what Keisha outlined at the beginning. We have to keep the pressure on the Congress to act in the interests of this nation, stopping the funding for Ukraine, stopping the prosecutions of Donald Trump, and increasingly creating the circumstances where we will have a Congress which is moving forward in terms of a new economic system, freeing us from this dying financial parasite that is squatting on top of us at this point. So, again, I don't think you can talk about a good outcome, whether it's in Congress or whether it's in the Mideast, unless we are pushing an entire process in the direction of something new. It's certainly implicit in President Trump's Agenda 47 policies, turning us back into a manufacturing superpower, unleashing our productive capacity through energy, through building new cities. He used terms in his speech in Michigan last week, talking about patriotic protectionism and economic nationalism. And it is only if the United States reestablishes itself as a sovereign republic with economic sovereignty that we will be able to play the role that we must play in crushing this global empire, which is the source of almost all of these evils. Toward the very end of the excerpt that I played you from Mr. LaRouche, he made the following point. He said, we must shift the world economy from being a monetary system to a credit system as established by Alexander Hamilton. And what that means is reversing every monetarist encroachment from 1971 back to 1913 and everything in between, and replace it. Again, I'm going to quote from Lyndon LaRouche from that excerpt. He said, our purpose is to set up a system of sovereign nation states in which each group of people using their own language and their own culture are self-represented. These nations so formed must also have a common interest in the betterment of the general condition of mankind. The only thing worth fighting for is to prevent evil from stopping that effort. And then he said, we as a people must develop a spiritual culture that is based on the creative powers of mankind to carry further the development of mankind. I think our enemies, unfortunately, understand that this is the nature of the fight, too often better than many of our allies do, which is why they're able to outflank us and, play the pawns on the chessboard from above. The more of our friends and allies who understand that this is the nature of the fight to replace a dying imperial system with a system of sovereign nations based on the American system of political economy. The sooner more people understand that, I think the sooner we can prevail in this fight. So I'll leave my remarks there. I know there's a lot going on, so let's open it up for questions and discussion.